Singapore Prime Minister Lawrence Wong says the country will do whatever it can to support the UN's mission, as well as Secretary-General António Guterres' leadership. He adds that Singapore will offer ideas, build bridges and broker solutions. In a CNA exclusive, the UN chief says Singapore has been decisive in the reforms that the global body has introduced, such as in climate campaign and on international financial architecture. Mr. Guterres concludes his three-day trip to Singapore today. Aslam Shah reports.
A pledge from Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong that the country is committed to strengthening the UN. Mr. Wong says the global body is a unique institution of special importance to Singapore.
It remains the only global body with universal participation and legitimacy. The UN framework respects the independence of its member states and gives each of them a voice in international affairs. At the same time, it recognizes the interdependence of nations and provides a platform for countries to address common challenges together.
Mr. Wong also describes Mr. António Guterres' leadership in these troubled times as exemplary. He praised the UN chief's commitment to international law and the UN Charter that helps assure the well-being, security and integrity of countries, as well as his tireless efforts in strengthening multilateralism.
You have been a strong advocate for global equity and justice. You have reminded the world not to neglect problems like poverty and hunger, even while you commenced work on frontier issues like artificial intelligence. Singapore shares your commitment to prevent inequality and the digital divide from widening further, and to make sustainable development a reality for all nations.
Mr. Guterres says Singapore is one of the most active countries in the UN. He notes the important role the island state plays.
Singapore has been in the front line of the voice of reason. And Singapore presides the Forum of Small States. And based on that, Singapore has been able to mobilize the majority of the countries, small states, but each country one vote, the majority of the countries of the United Nations, in order to make the United Nations a strong instrument to protect the planet and to create more equity and justice in the relations among countries.
During the visit, the UN chief went to places such as Gardens by the Bay. At the Marina Barrage, he was briefed on Singapore's efforts to promote water security. During a tour of the Punggol Regional Library, digital inclusion policies were shared with him. This is his first official visit to Singapore and comes at the invitation of PM Wong. This new orchid hybrid was named in the 75-year-old's honour. Now, Mr. Guterres' visit comes ahead of the Summit of the Future in less than 3 weeks. Now, the high-level global events will be attended by world leaders to forge a new international consensus. Now, Singapore supports the summit along with other UN efforts and regards rules-based multilateralism as key to its peace and security.
President Tharman Shanmugaratnam and Senior Minister Hsien also met with the UN chief. President Tharman says Mr. Guterres has been a voice for peace and for a world where might is not right. He adds that the UN chief advocates for bolder and effective cooperation in the interests of all nations. SM Lee says they had a good discussion on the challenges faced by the multilateral system. He adds that a strong rules-based framework is especially important for the peace and security of small states like Singapore. It is even more critical as the world navigates and shapes norms in new areas like AI. In an exclusive interview with CNA's Look Wei Su, the UN chief emphasized the need to reaffirm the values of the UN Charter with an appeal towards what he calls a global conscience. He blamed global chaos and geopolitical divisions for blocking efforts to resolve conflicts around the world.
I think we have two kinds of problems. First of all, we have a problem of the Security Council itself that was created after the Second World War with a composition that doesn't correspond to the world as the world it is today. And on the other hand, the geopolitical divisions have made it very difficult for the Security Council to take decisions. But sometimes the Security Council is able to take a decision, and you mentioned one. The problem is to implement that decision. And another of the consequences of the geopolitical divide, the fact that superpowers are at odds with each other, is that no other country today is afraid of anything. And so they see a resolution of the Security Council, but they are not afraid that the powers will impose it. What it creates is a sense of impunity. It's a sense that anybody can do whatever they want because nothing will happen to them. And so we see countries that systematically repudiate the decision of the Security Council. This time it was Israel, but you see the same in other crises in other parts of the world.
I suppose this characteristic of chronic impunity of action, and you have tied it to a fundamental paradox. So essentially, this international system now, there's no getting around the fact that we are individual sovereign nation states.
I think we need to affirm more than ever the Charter, the values of the Charter, international law and international humanitarian law. And more than ever, it's necessary to appeal to the global conscience in order to make sure that the Charter and its values prevail, that international law prevails, that international humanitarian law prevails, and that those that violate these sacred principles have face accountability. Unfortunately, in the present situation, as there is no respect, as there is a sense of impunity, we see all these violations without any kind of accountability.
Now, there's lots of calls over the decades for structural reform. In your time as UN chief, this is not something realistically you could have hoped for.
I mean, there is one thing, for instance, that is absolutely outrageous. When the UN was created, very few African countries existed. Most African countries were under colonial rule. And today we still have not one single African permanent member of the Security Council. This is unacceptable. This must be corrected. So it's time to adjust the composition of the Security Council to the reality of today's world. And a few years ago, when I started my mandate, this was a taboo. Nobody was ready to discuss it. Recently, we had a session in the Security Council, promoted by Sierra Leone, in which the question was exactly the need to correct the structural injustice made to Africa not to have any member of the any permanent member of the Security Council, and everybody, including the permanent members, including the P5, agreed. So now I have the hope, and I hope the Summit of the Future will be also an impulse in that direction. I have the hope that there will be a serious discussion on how to reform the Security Council and make it more corresponding to what it is today's world, and at the same time to have some improvement in its rules and its procedures to make it more effective.